On the Soul and the Resurrection by Saint Gregory of Nyssa. Part 2. Would not the defenders of the opposite belief say this, that the body, being composite, must necessarily be resolved into that of which it is composed? And when the coalition of elements in the body ceases, each of those elements naturally gravitates toward its kindred element with the irresistible bias of like to like. The heat in us will thus unite with heat, the earthy with the solid, and each of the other elements also will pass toward its like. Where then will the soul be after that? If one affirm that it is in those elements, one will be obliged to admit that it is identical with them, for this fusion could not possibly take place between two things of different natures. But this being granted, the soul must necessarily be viewed as a complex thing, fused as it is with qualities so opposite. But the complex is not simple, and must be classed with the composite, and the composite is necessarily dissoluble, and dissolution means the destruction of the compound, and the destructible is not immortal, else the flesh itself, resolvable as it is into its constituent elements, might so be called immortal. If, on the other hand, the soul is something other than these elements, where can our reason suggest a place for it to be, when it is thus, by virtue of its alien nature, not to be discovered in these elements, and there is no other place in the world either where it may continue, in harmony with its own peculiar character, to exist? But if a thing can be found nowhere, plainly it has no existence. The teacher sighed gently at these words of mine, and then said, "Maybe these were the objections, or such as these, that the Stoics and Epicureans collected at Athens made in answer to the apostle. I hear that Epicurus carried his theories in this very direction. The framework of things was to his mind a fortuitous and mechanical affair, without a providence penetrating its operations. And as a piece with this, he thought that human life was like a bubble, existing only as long as the breath within was held in by the enveloping substance, inasmuch as our body was a mere membrane, as it were, encompassing a breath, and that on the collapse of the inflation, the imprisoned essence was extinguished. To him, the visible was the limit of existence. He made our senses the only means of our apprehension of things. He completely closed the eyes of his soul, and was incapable of seeing anything in the intelligible and immaterial world, just as a man who is imprisoned in a cabin whose walls and roof obstruct the view outside remains without a glimpse of all the wonders in the sky. Verily, everything in the universe that is seen to be an object of sense is like an earthen wall, forming in itself a barrier between the narrower souls and that intelligible world which is ready for their contemplation. And it is the earth and water and fire alone that such behold. Whence comes each of these elements, in what and by what they are encompassed, such souls, because of their narrowness, cannot detect. While the sight of a garment suggests to anyone the weaver of it, and the thought of the shipwright comes at the sight of the ship, and the hand of the builder is brought to the mind of him who sees the building, these little souls gaze upon the world, but their eyes are blind to him whom all this that we see around us makes manifest. And so they propound their clever and pungent doctrines about the soul's vanishment, body from elements, and elements from body, and besides, the impossibility of the soul's self-existence if it is not to be one of these elements or lodged in one. For if these opponents suppose that by virtue of the soul not being akin to the elements, it is nowhere after death, they must propound, to begin with, the absence of the soul from fleshly life as well, seeing that the body itself is nothing but a concourse of those elements. And so they must not tell us that the soul is to be found there either, independently vivifying their compound. If it is not possible for the soul to exist after death, though the elements do, then I say, according to this teaching, our life as well is proved to be nothing else but death. But if, on the other hand, they do not make the existence of the soul now in the body a question for doubt, how can they maintain its evanishment when the body is resolved into its elements? Then, secondly, they must employ an equal audacity against the God in this nature too. For how can they assert that the intelligible and immaterial unseen can be dissolved and diffused into the wet and the soft, as also into the hot and the dry, and so hold together the universe in existence through being, though not of a kindred nature with the things which it penetrates, yet not thereby incapable of so penetrating them? Let them therefore remove from their system the very deity who upholds the world. This is the very point, I said, upon which our adversaries cannot fail to have doubts, viz., that all things depend on God and are encompassed by him, or that there is any divinity at all transcending the physical world. It would be more fitting, she cried, to be silent about such doubts, and not deign to make any answer to such foolish and wicked propositions. For there is a divine precept forbidding us to answer a fool in his folly. And he must be a fool, as the prophet declares, who says that there is no God. But since one needs must speak, I will urge upon you an argument which is not mine, nor that of any human being, for it would then be of small value whoever spoke it, but an argument which the whole creation enunciates by the medium of its wonders to the audience of the eye, with a skilful and artistic utterance that reaches the heart. Creation proclaims outright the Creator. For the very heavens, as the prophet says, declare the glory of God with their unutterable words. We see the universal harmony in the wondrous sky and on the wondrous earth, how elements essentially opposed to each other are all woven together in an ineffable union to serve one common end, each contributing its particular force to maintain the whole. How the unmingling and mutually repellent do not fly apart from each other by virtue of their peculiarities, any more than they are destroyed when compounded by such contrariety. How those elements which are naturally buoyant move downwards, the heat of the sun, for instance, descending in its rays, while the bodies which possess weight are lifted by becoming rarefied in vapor, so that water, contrary to its nature, ascends, being conveyed through the air to the upper regions. How, too, that fire of the firmament so penetrates the earth that even its abysses feel the heat. how the moisture of the rain, infused into the soil, generates, one though it be by nature, myriads of differing seeds, and animates, in due proportion, each subject of its influence. How very swiftly the polar sphere revolves, how the orbits within it move the contrary way, with all the eclipses and conjunctions and measured intervals of the planets. We see all this with the piercing eyes of the mind, nor can we fail to be taught by means of such a spectacle that the divine power, working with skill and method, is manifesting itself in this actual world, and penetrating each portion, combines those portions with the whole, and completes the whole by the portions, and encompasses the universe with a single all-controlling force, self-centered and self-contained, never ceasing from its motion, yet never altering the position which it holds. "And pray how," I asked, "does this belief in the existence of God prove, along with it, the existence of the human soul? For God, surely, is not the same thing as the soul, so that if one were believed in, the other must necessarily be believed in." She replied, "It has been said by wise men that man is a little world in himself, and contains all the elements which go to complete the universe. If this view is a true one, and so it seems, perhaps we shall need no other ally than it to establish the truth of our conception of the soul. And our conception of it is this, that it exists with a rare and peculiar nature of its own, independent of the body with its gross texture. We get our exact knowledge of this outer world from the apprehension of our senses, and these sensational operations themselves lead us on to the understanding of the supersensual world of fact and thought. And our eye thus becomes the interpreter of that almighty wisdom which is visible in the universe, and points in itself to the being who encompasses it. Just so, when we look to our inner world, we find no slight grounds there also, in the known, for conjecturing the unknown. And the unknown there also is that which, being the object of thought and not of sight, eludes the grasp of sense." I rejoined, "Nay, it may be very possible to infer a wisdom transcending the universe from the skilful and artistic designs observable in this harmonized fabric of physical nature, but, as regards the soul, what knowledge is possible to those who would trace, from any indications the body has to give, the unknown through the known?" "Most certainly," the Virgin replied, "to those who wish to follow the wise proverb and know themselves. The soul herself is a competent instructress. Of the fact, I mean, that she is an immaterial and spiritual thing, working and moving in a way corresponding to her peculiar nature, and evincing these peculiar emotions through the organs of the body. For this bodily organization exists the same even in those who have just been reduced by death to the state of corpses. But it remains without motion or action, because the force of the soul is no longer in it. It moves only when there is sensation in the organs, and not only that, but the mental force, by means of that sensation, penetrates with its own impulses and moves whither it will all those organs of sensation." "What then," I asked, "is the soul? Perhaps there may be some possible means of delineating its nature, so that we may have some comprehension of this subject in the way of a sketch." "Its definition," the teacher replied, has been attempted in different ways by different writers, each according to his own bent. But the following is our opinion about it. The soul is an essence, created and living and intellectual, transmitting from itself to an organized and sentient body the power of living and of grasping objects of sense, as long as a natural constitution capable of this holds together. Saying this, she pointed to the physician who was sitting to watch her state, and said, "There is a proof of what I say, close by us. How, I ask, does this man, by putting his fingers to feel the pulse, hear, in a manner, through this sense of touch, nature calling loudly to him and telling him of her peculiar pain? In fact, that the disease in the body is an inflammatory one, and that the malady originates in this or that internal organ, and that there is such and such a degree of fever. How, too, is he taught by the agency of the eye other facts of this kind, when he looks to see the posture of the patient and watches the wasting of the flesh? As, too, the state of the complexion, pale somewhat and bilious, and the gaze of the eyes, as is the case with those in pain, involuntarily inclining to sadness, indicate the internal condition. So the ear gives information of the like, ascertaining the nature of the malady by the shortness of the breathing, and by the groan that comes with it. One might say that even the sense of smell in the expert is not incapable of detecting the kind of disorder, but that it notices the secret suffering of the vitals in the particular quality of the breath. Could this be so, if there were not a certain force of intelligence present in each organ of the senses? What would our hand have taught us of itself, without thought conducting it from feeling to understanding the subject before it? What would the ear as separate from mind, or the eye, or the nostril, or any other organ, have helped toward the settling of the question all by themselves? Verily, it is most true what one of heathen culture is recorded to have said, that it is the mind that sees and the mind that hears. Else, if you will not allow this to be true, you must tell me why, when you look at the sun, as you have been trained by your instructor to look at him, you assert that he is not in the breadth of his disk, the size he appears to the many, but that he exceeds by many times the measure of the entire earth. Do you not confidently maintain that it is so, because you have arrived by reasoning, through phenomena, at the conception of such and such a movement, of distances of such and such of time and space, of such causes of eclipse? And when you look at the waxing and waning moon, you are taught other truths by the visible figure of that heavenly body, that it is itself devoid of life, and that it revolves in the circle nearest the earth, and that it is lit by light from the sun, just as is the case with mirrors, which, receiving the sun upon them, do not reflect rays of their own, but those of the sun, whose light is given back from their smooth, flashing surface. Those who see this but do not examine it think that the light comes from the moon herself, but that this is not the case is proved by this, that when she is diametrically facing the sun, she has the whole of the disk that looks our way illuminated, but as she traverses her own circle of revolution quicker from moving in a narrower space, she herself has completed this more than 12 times before the sun has once travelled round his, whence it happens that her substance is not always covered by light, for her position facing him is not maintained in the frequency of her revolutions, but while this position causes the whole side of the moon which looks to us to be illumined, directly she moves sideways, her hemisphere, which is turned to us, necessarily becomes partially shadowed, and only that which is turned to him meets his embracing rays. The brightness, in fact, keeps on retiring from that which can no longer see the sun to that which still sees him, until she passes right across the sun's disk and receives his rays upon her hinder part. And then the fact of her being in herself totally devoid of light and splendor causes the side turned to us to be invisible, while the further hemisphere is all in light. And this is called the completion of her waning. But when again in her own revolution she has passed the sun, and she is transverse to his rays, the side which was dark just before begins to shine a little, for the rays move from this illumined part to that so lately invisible. You see what the eye does teach, and yet it would never of itself have afforded this insight without something that looks through the eyes and uses the data of the senses as mere guides to penetrate from the apparent to the unseen. It is needless to add the methods of geometry that lead us step by step through visible delineations to truths which lie out of sight, and countless other instances which all prove that apprehension is the work of an intellectual essence deeply seated in our nature, acting through the operation of our bodily senses. End of Part 2 of On the Soul and the Resurrection.